November 11th, 1945. Marseille. 7:10 hours. The truck brakes screamed once and went quiet beside the old port, and Sergeant John McKenna stepped down into air that smelled of diesel, wet rope, coal smoke, and fish left too long in broken ice. Dawn hung over the harbor as a dirty grey film, flattening ships into shadows and turning every crane into a gallows. French laborers were already hauling Allied surplus out of a freighter's belly. Ration tins, blankets, spark plugs, tires, crates stamped with United States Army ordnance markings. Every box looked counted. Every box looked already stolen. McKenna watched the line of men bend and rise in the fog and understood that the war had not ended here. It had only changed uniforms. The result was a city still living on wartime hunger. The cost was that nothing on the waterfront meant only what it claimed to be. A boy no older than 12 ran past with a sack under one arm, clipped McKenna's shoulder, spat a curse in rough Marseille slang, and vanished between two wine trucks. In Chicago, a street kid ran because he had stolen something. In Marseille, everybody ran because somebody else had. He looked across the water to the alleys feeding the port. The place had the same look certain neighborhoods got back home before raids, when everyone knew the law was near and no one believed the law mattered. The result was recognition. The cost was losing the illusion that being an American sergeant would give him control. Etienne Roussel found him there with a cigarette in the corner of his mouth and his overcoat collar turned up against the sea damp. During the war, Etienne had blown up German rail lines for the resistance. After the war, he wore a tie and served as a French liaison to men like McKenna. He nodded toward the harbor, then toward the streets behind the exchange building and the buried arteries under the old stones. During the occupation, he said, the Germans had used the underground drains and storage tunnels to move things they did not want listed: paintings, fuel, ammunition, men. McKenna asked what was still down there now. Etienne drew on his cigarette and said the city had changed its cargo. The things under Marseille were no longer stolen objects. They were people who did not wish to be found. The result was a wider horizon than missing cargo. The cost was that a routine port posting now sat beside something darker. Major Harris gave him the official version of his week an hour later in a requisition office that smelled of damp paper and army coffee. 3 military jeeps had vanished off the books over 6 weeks. On paper, they were transport losses, clerical confusion, port transfer waste. In reality, they had rolled somewhere else with somebody's help. McKenna would look into it because he was a military policeman and because a good sergeant could make a small embarrassment disappear before it grew teeth. Then Harris leaned back and told him not to dig so far that the case stopped being an American nuisance and started becoming a French problem. The order gave McKenna legal entry into the docks, the vehicle logs, the depots, and the warehouse books. The cost sat in Harris's tone. Men who say, "Do not dig too deep," are usually standing on something. That night, McKenna took his supper in a waterfront bar where the mirrors were cracked and the wine was cheap. Lucia noticed his military police insignia before he noticed her. She was Italian by her accent, thinner than she should have been, with hands that never stopped moving unless she was afraid. She asked if he knew an American named Frank Castro. McKenna looked up sharply. Frank was from the same Chicago neighborhood. They had learned to fight in the same alleys and patch shoes with the same cheap leather when winter ate through the soles. Frank had stayed in Europe after the surrender because, in his last postcard, Marseille had promised meat, money, and one last chance to get ahead. He had written, "Marseille, plenty of meat. Come." Then he had disappeared. Lucia said Frank claimed to be military police too, but whatever business he had been doing in the old port did not look like police work. The result was a live direction. The cost was that the missing friend McKenna came ready to rescue had just shifted into a man who might have crossed over. He followed the first trace the next afternoon to a boarding house called the Sailor's Home, near the harbor's edge. The landlady remembered Frank because Americans tipped, and because Frank had come and gone with a Frenchman in a grey overcoat who never gave a name. They would sit in the kitchen after midnight and talk about things beneath the docks. When McKenna asked to see the cellar, two men came out of the passage behind the counter and blocked the door. Their haircuts were too close, their coats too heavy, their expressions too practiced for ordinary drunks. One still had militia on him. McKenna flashed his identification. They ignored it. He dropped the nearer man with a strike under the ear, then drove the other back into the wall with his shoulder. As the first man went down, he shouted that McKenna was looking for the American who had asked the wrong questions and gone where he should not have gone. The answer gave McKenna more than resistance. It proved Frank's disappearance belonged to an active secret. The cost was that the secret had now seen McKenna's face. When he returned to his billet after midnight, the warning was waiting in the shape of absence. His footlocker stood open. Shirts had been unfolded and dropped aside. Frank's postcard was gone. Nothing else was missing. It was not a thief's work. It was a search. Careful and insulting. Someone wanted him to know they had found the one piece of paper that tied him to the missing man. Missing jeeps were paperwork. A turned-over billet meant a live hand had reached through the dark and touched him. The result was certainty that he was no longer following a trail alone. The cost was that he could no longer pretend he was only asking harmless questions. Harris listened to the report the next morning with the patient expression of a man hearing about rain. He told McKenna, in effect, that Marseille was not Chicago, and that if every missing American in Europe became an army matter, no one would ever go home. If McKenna wanted closure on a vanished friend, he could write to the Red Cross like everybody else. Then he returned to the Jeep reports and dismissed him. McKenna left the office knowing two things. First, Harris had not been surprised enough. Second, every word he reported upstairs now had a chance of traveling sideways before it traveled forward. The result was that official channels narrowed instead of opening. The cost was that the next step would have to be taken outside them. Father O'Brien gave him that next step over weak coffee in the military police mess. The chaplain had spent the war collecting confessions, favors, and rumors men could not carry alone. He said that if McKenna truly wanted to know what moved under Marseille, he should stop asking people who wrote reports and ask people who sold information. There was a man called Marcel at the Three Anchors Cafe in the Old Quarter. He knew the tunnels, the black market, and the prices fear charged after dark. McKenna told himself he was only going to ask one more question, only going to find out whether Frank had died stupid or lived dirty. The result of that lie was enough comfort to get him moving. The cost was that he did not believe it himself. Marcel waited in the Three Anchors, like a man who had paid dearly for the right to sit still. He was Corsican, lame in one leg, with a burn scar climbing from his jaw to his ear in a pale twist. McKenna laid Frank's name on the table. Marcel did not flinch. He only named a price. $200 American in cash for the last 7 days of Frank Castro's life in Marseille, delivered complete. It was 4 months of a sergeant's pay. McKenna paid it anyway. Marcel then told him that Frank had been moving regularly between the old port and an underground entry near the exchange. He had been seen meeting a German-accented man who called himself a Swiss trader. On September 15th, Frank entered the drains below the city and never came back up. Marcel slid a wrinkled hand-drawn map across the table. A cross marked an old sluice gate under Saint-Pierre warehouse, modified by the Germans in 1943. The result was the first route solid enough to walk. The cost was that McKenna had just paid for the road likely to bury him. Lucia found him before dusk. During the occupation, she said, German soldiers had forced women like her to carry food and laundry into places polite maps did not mark. She knew the first stretch of the underground route by smell, by turns. by where the ceiling dropped low enough to skin your knuckles if you forgot to duck. Marcel agreed to lead the rest. Together, they went down after midnight through an access point concealed behind broken masonry and rusted service piping. Above ground, Marseille smelled of tobacco, fish, mud, and fuel. Below ground, it smelled of iron water, old rot, and concrete that had forgotten the sun. On the wall, half buried under mildew, McKenna caught the fading black letters of a German warning, Achtung, Minen. There were no mines now, but the warning told him the place had once been organized, not improvised. The result was a space with military memory still clinging to it. The cost was that every step downward made the city above feel less reachable. The beam of Marcel's flashlight moved over empty wine bottles, a ragged blanket roll, the torn wrapper of American field rations, then stopped. A service cap lay in a shallow runnel of black water where the tunnel dipped. McKenna bent and picked it up. The serial number was still there inside the band. Frank's. Not a guess, not a rumor. Frank had been in this dark, breathing this wet air. McKenna stood without speaking. Marcel said only that there was deeper tunnel below. McKenna wanted to keep going right then. Instead, he forced himself to climb back out. The cap proved direction. It did not yet prove the whole machine. The result was discipline at the edge of grief. The cost was that he had to leave the first true piece of Frank's trail in the dark. The next morning, he used his badge, his rank, and the Jeep investigation to enter Saint-Pierre warehouse under official authority. On paper, the building was under French administration and leased to a private concern called Eastern Transport Company. In practice, it looked like the kind of place all empires leave behind when they retreat too fast. McKenna checked manifests, vehicle logs, fuel chits, and Swiss bank payment receipts that had no reason to belong in a war warehouse, but did anyway. Certain surnames repeated in the margins and side contracts: von Straser, Becker, Hoffman. Near a sidewall hidden by tarpaulin and spare axle parts, he found a round iron cover set into the concrete. When he pulled the oilcloth away, a draft rose cold and damp through the seams. He lowered his head and heard water moving far below. The result was the first clean join between the surface operation and the world under it. The cost was that the hidden route was now no longer theory. They acted fast. Lucia came to him that evening shaking hard enough to rattle her bracelets. Someone had grabbed her in a lane off the harbor, held a knife to her throat, and cut away a lock of her hair before letting her go. No money taken, only a message. We know which woman took the American underground. He could send her away. He could stop. Instead, he went looking for Etienne and pushed until the Frenchman agreed, reluctantly, to help him get into Saint-Pierre after hours. The result was one more ally pulled over the line. The cost was that McKenna's decisions were now endangering people who had not belonged to Frank's story until he dragged them in. They entered the warehouse late, by a side service door Etienne could open because post-war France still ran on old loyalties more than new stamps. Marcel came with them. Lucia insisted on coming too. Beneath the iron cover, the ladder rungs sweated under their gloves. Below the first passage they found a second level, older and drier, bricked in by 19th century engineers and altered by German hands. There the tunnel widened into rooms cut from stone and reinforced with timber. There were bunks, a field radio, shelves of canned food, file drawers. On a table lay identity packets stamped with forged Red Cross seals and Catholic travel papers naming dead or invented men as Spanish correspondents, Syrian merchants, Argentine landowners. It was not a hiding place. It was a transit station. The result was that Frank's disappearance expanded into a structure big enough to reach beyond Marseille. The cost was that McKenna now possessed knowledge men killed to protect. He found the list in a metal file box whose lock had been forced and repaired more than once. Across the top, typed in German and French, were words that made the whole arrangement suddenly legible. Marseille Node. Transfer Register. October 1945. Beneath them ran 17 names, each paired with a former SS rank, a fresh civilian identity, and a destination route out through Spain or across the Atlantic. Near the bottom was Frank Castro. No rank, no alias, only one note. Informant, handled. Burial point. Sluice Gate 3. McKenna's knees hit the damp floor before he realized they had bent. Frank had not vanished into chance. He had been useful, then inconvenient, then removed. The result was the answer he had come for. The cost was that there was no longer any way to treat this as a friend gone missing in a foreign city. Marcel's hand closed once on his shoulder and then pulled away. There was no time for sorrow. From somewhere down the passage came the unmistakable sound of men moving through shallow water in haste. The list had not lain dead in a drawer. Somebody still serviced this place. Somebody had come back to find it open. McKenna stuffed the register inside his coat. The first shot cracked against the masonry a moment later and sent dust down from the arch overhead. They ran. Lucia stumbled on the slick incline to the lower channel and cried out when a round tore into her leg below the knee. Marcel lifted her without asking permission, his bad leg dragging. He told McKenna to keep moving, to take Etienne, to get the list out because paper could still matter even when people could not. The result was a single surviving objective: carry the names into daylight. The cost was that McKenna had to choose evidence over everybody. At Sluice Gate 3, the tunnel opened into a drainage chamber where old iron teeth hung over a black channel. Etienne shoved him toward a side crawl space that led to a public exit above ground. But McKenna's light caught on bones in silt near the wall. Not a full skeleton. Enough. A belt buckle, a ruined jacket, American service boots on what remained of the legs. One sole had been patched with a mismatched piece of leather sewn in a sloppy half-moon shape. McKenna knew that patch. He had helped stitch it in a Chicago kitchen with an awl borrowed from Frank's mother because neither of them had money for new shoes that winter. Frank had died in the dark with the same bad boot repair from home still under him. McKenna lurched toward the remains. Etienne dragged him bodily away as another shot ricocheted off iron. The result was certainty so complete it could be touched. The cost was that he had to leave his friend a second time. They crawled out behind a public lavatory near the harbour, soaked, stinking, and half-blind from tunnel dark. The list was still inside McKenna's coat. Marcel and Lucia did not come out behind them. By dawn, the old port had begun another day of loading and theft when two bodies rolled gently against the quay steps under the attention of gulls. Marcel's throat had been cut clean. Lucia's lungs were full of harbour water. French police called it a gang quarrel before breakfast. McKenna stood over the water and understood that the city had settled its account with his witnesses overnight. The result was a clean erasure from the public record. The cost was that every surviving fact now rested in one wet register inside his coat. He took the list straight to Harris because some piece of old training still wanted to believe there was a correct door, a correct desk, a correct handoff for a thing like this. Harris read only enough to see the shape of what McKenna carried before his face went still. He said the investigation was over. He said the document would go to the proper people. He said Marseille was full of rumors dressed as evidence, and that military police sergeants were not paid to decide matters of international consequence. McKenna heard the phrasing more than the order. Proper people. Not investigative branch, not legal, not command. Proper people. He looked at Harris and saw, not proof, but recognition. The Major had known this traffic existed. Maybe not every name, maybe not every tunnel, but enough to fear paper more than bodies. The result was that the enemy moved from the sewers into the office. The cost was that McKenna lost the last institution he could safely trust. He locked himself in his room that night, with Frank's recovered boot on the table, and the register laid open beside it. Somewhere along the line, the war had taught everyone to sort evil by uniform. Lose the uniform, change the papers, shave the moustache, and the world began arguing about jurisdiction. Father O'Brien knocked once and entered when McKenna did not answer. He looked at the boot a long time before speaking. "The hardest thing after a war," he said, "is not counting the dead. It is learning which men never stopped fighting and which men learned to profit from the fact." McKenna asked him what a man was supposed to do when justice itself had mildew on it. O'Brien said only that some documents are meant to be filed and some are meant to burn in such a way that others see the smoke. The result was not comfort, it was a direction. The cost was that direction required McKenna to step completely outside the safe meaning of his badge. He made 3 copies before dawn. One he mailed through channels that bypassed Harris entirely, addressed to the Army Criminal Investigation people handling war profiteering and post-war escapes in Europe. One he sealed in oilcloth and hid where Marcel had once told him old smugglers kept reserve cargo under loose stones above a secondary drain. The 3rd he kept on his body. The original stayed with him until he knew what had to be done with it. Each copy reduced the chance that one killing would bury the names. Each copy also increased the number of crimes he was committing against chain of command, procedure, and his own future. McKenna chose danger because disgrace in this case meant handing Frank and the others back to silence. The result was that the list ceased to be a single vulnerable object. The cost was that McKenna himself became expendable to more people than before. He sent word to Harris the next day that he had hidden the original register somewhere near the old port and would trade it in person that night if the major came alone. Harris told McKenna that men who thought they were clever in Marseille usually ended up in the water. McKenna said perhaps so, but once the names had begun moving, more hands than Harris's would reach for them. That was enough. McKenna heard the silence on the other end of the line and knew the bait had entered the bloodstream. The result was that he forced his superior to react on McKenna's timetable. The cost was that if his mailed copy failed to land where it needed to, no one would come when the trap closed. He never went to the meeting point. Instead, he returned to Saint-Pierre warehouse alone after dark, armed with his issued M1 carbine, and the kind of patience Chicago had taught him in hallways with bad wiring and worse men behind doors. He went down through the concealed iron cover to the transit room below and set 1 copy of the register on the table where the forged papers had once waited for new names. Then he touched a match to the edge and watched the paper blacken, curl, and brighten. He did not burn the names because he wanted them gone. He burned them because flame draws men faster than fear. The result was a signal no one guarding the tunnel could ignore. The cost was that McKenna had now deliberately placed himself at the exact center of the place that had already consumed Frank. He heard them before he saw them. Water displaced in careful steps. Metal brushing concrete. One man whispered to another in German to take the left passage. McKenna moved first, using the room's timber braces and side culverts the way beat cops use alley dumpsters and stairwells. He fired once, and the nearest figure folded against the wall, submachine gun clattering into the channel. The second man answered with a burst that chewed splinters from the old beam beside McKenna's face. He dropped flat, rolled into a runoff trench, and came up farther down the passage where the ceiling dipped low. He saw the man's outline in the muzzle flash and shot center mass. By the time the third one understood he was hunting a policeman who had become a cornered animal in a maze, McKenna had reached the sluice controls and kicked a rusted gate lever hard enough to loosen it. A sheet of backed water burst through a half-stuck channel door and slammed the man sideways against the masonry. McKenna crossed the space and ended it at close range. One of the dead carried papers naming him as von Strisse, one of the surnames from the warehouse books. The result was survival and the removal of the 3 men sent to clean the tunnel. The cost was final. There was no longer any honest way to say McKenna had remained only an investigator. When he climbed back to the warehouse floor, blinking into the weak light of pre-dawn, engines were already outside. Not port trucks, army vehicles, voices, boots, Orders in American English. The mailed copy had found its readers in time. Criminal investigators and armed escorts were moving through the loading bays with clipboards and pistols, while 2 military police from another unit stood beside Harris, whose freedom had clearly narrowed. The major looked at McKenna with exhausted contempt. As they took him past, Harris bent just enough to murmur that McKenna had made a great noise and maybe even done a little good, but 3 of the names on that register were already gone beyond reach. "You will never catch them all," he said. McKenna believed him. That was the worst part. The result was a victory that touched real bodies and real files. The cost was the knowledge that history does not close, because one warehouse does. By March of 1946, the harbor smelled different, not cleaner. Spring in Marseille only changed the rot. It softened it. McKenna stood where he had first stood in November and watched laborers move cargo off another ship. Somewhere beneath the stones, the drains still ran under the city, carrying runoff, secrets, and what remained of the war out toward the sea. A boy ran past him again, perhaps the same one, perhaps not. This time, the boy slowed, looked up, and gave him a quick, assessing nod before disappearing into the alleys. A city does not forgive. At best, it revises your place inside it. The result was a small acknowledgement from Marseille. The cost was that such acknowledgements are enough to keep certain men from leaving. Of the 17 names on the register, 14 had been intercepted, delayed, or dragged back into papers and cells by the time the reports reached the right desks. 3 had slipped through before the net tightened. Argentina took one. Spain swallowed another. The third became smoke somewhere between a church route and a freighter manifest. Frank stayed where McKenna had found him in the dark, though the recovery teams would eventually go down for him. Marcel went into a cheap cemetery under his own name because McKenna insisted on it. Lucia went into the ground with flowers from 3 women on the waterfront and no priest who knew enough to speak the whole truth. The tally was not justice. But it was not forgetting either. The result was a partial accounting. The cost was that partial accounting is the most honest victory war usually leaves behind. McKenna lit a cigarette and watched the smoke flatten in the harbor wind. Frank had once asked him why any sane man would stay in Europe once the shooting stopped. McKenna had joked that Chicago did not have this kind of fog. The truth stood before him now in the wet light and the working port and the water that hid more than it showed. Chicago had corruption. Chicago had dead men. But Chicago had not shown him the exact place where a war kept moving after the armistice by changing documents and changing clothes. Marseille had. He reached into the canvas satchel at his feet and took out the one thing he had kept for himself, Frank's boot, the patched sole still visible where 2 boys from the same neighborhood had once stitched winter out by hand. He weighed it once, then threw it into the harbor. It hit with a small, ordinary splash and was gone almost at once. The water settled quickly. Harbors always do. McKenna watched the ripples flatten over the place where the boot had vanished and thought of the tunnel air, the register, the false papers, the cold note beside Frank's name, the lock of Lucia's hair in her shaking hand, Marcel leaning on his ruined leg and saying paper could still matter. War had taught enough men how to kill. The peace afterward had taught other men how to hide killing inside freight ledgers, transit seals, and polite offices. That was the battle Marseille had shown him. The slow underground current carrying the guilty away, unless somebody was willing to get wet enough to find the inlet. He stood there until the cigarette burned down to his fingers, then dropped it under his boot and ground it out. The city around him kept loading ships. The water kept moving under the stones. And now, at last, he knew where to listen.